Hi, Dominic.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm excellent. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Dominic Johnson. You teach international relations at Oxford University, which everyone has heard of. And we're going to talk about war and why it keeps happening, what it is about human psychology that makes it keep happening. You've written a book relevant to this called Overconfidence and War, The Havoc and Glory of Positive Illusions. By the way, you've also written a book that's less directly relevant, but it's called God is Watching You, How the Fear of God Makes Us Human. We're going to focus on a paper you've recently co-authored with another Dominic Tierney, called The Negativity Bias in International Relations, which turns out to cover a number of psychological dynamics that seem to be conducive to war. And, you have a thesis here in the paper that these dynamics should be grouped under the label negativity bias, that there is a kind of a unity to them. And we'll get to that, but I think for the purposes of our audience, we should first talk about the individual psychological dynamics that you want to put under that rubric, right? Mm-hmm. That, and I guess the big three are threat sensitivity or threat inflation, loss aversion, and failure salience. Now, do all three of those come under the heading of cognitive biases in your view? I mean,
perhaps not traditionally. We invented the term failure salience because we observed an empirical phenomenon that didn't seem to have a name. But yeah, broadly speaking, these are cognitive biases. Okay.
And I should say not all of them are obviously bad, and not all manifestations of them are obvious are bad, but collectively they seem to have at a minimum failed to help us stop having repeated wars. So why don't we talk about maybe the most straightforward of them first, which is threat sensitivity. Now, is that the same as threat inflation? That's a term you use
right.
too.
So this is part of the problem with my part of the field, that I come from a background in biology and then got very interested in psychology and evolution. And now I'm working in an environment with political scientists and social scientists. So there's often kind of a language gap. Threat inflation is the word that the political scientists use when they're thinking about states and how they assess other states. Mm-hmm. Whereas a psychologist probably would not use that term, but I think they're referring to more or less the same empirical phenomenon.
Okay. And it's a tendency to, be very attentive to the possibility that another country is a threat, and to, kind of in objective terms, often inflate that threat, to exaggerate the threat in your own mind. Absolutely. I mean, I guess maybe it's hard to disentangle the phenomenon of politicians genuinely perceiving the threat and kind of wagging the dog, as they say. In other words, with conscious self-interest, political self-interest in mind, actually exaggerating a threat. Probably both of those happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so, just to back up a tiny bit, my original interest was actually in the opposite phenomenon, overconfidence and overestimating things in international relations. And that was my first book on international relations, was on overconfidence and war. And then recently I began reading about the negativity bias, which seemed to be saying almost the opposite. And we'll come to some of those differences perhaps in a bit. But the kind of big one in international relations was exactly as you said, that it's quite common to find people referring to threat inflation, that states are overly concerned about potential enemies and how bad the enemies they do have are. Mm-hmm. But of course, the null hypothesis is, they're doing this for good reason, right? They've got to rally support for very expensive defense budgets, often very unpopular policies, which might end up getting them embroiled in a conflict. So they're bound to hype up the potential threat. So that could be, I think it is one explanation, but the point we're making is that it seems to go above and beyond that, and they really genuinely believe that these other states typically present much more of a threat than they really do.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's true that there's an irony in thinking that both overconfidence and threat sensitivity could play a role. One is positive, one's negative. That's ironic, but it's not like impossible to reconcile them. I mean, Iraq is a good example. We thought there was a real threat in Iraq in 2003 for reasons that, in retrospect, are unclear, not just because the evidence was exaggerated, but even if you took at face value everything the administration was saying. Okay, they weren't saying that Iraq had nuclear weapons at the moment. They weren't saying that they had a biological weapon that was of a devastating kind. In other words, a contagious kind. Anthrax is not contagious. So there wasn't. It's not like there was any kind of clear and present danger, even in the administration's rendering. And yet, we found a country very far away to be threatening enough to invade. Okay, so there's the threat sensitivity, but there was simultaneously the overconfidence, and there was no that we would win the war easily and there would be no big problems afterwards. Those two are not logically incompatible. It is a big threat, but we will win the war. These can, that's not. There's no big cognitive dissonance there, right, to resolve.
No, I don't think so. This was a challenge for us in the paper. Particularly for me, coming from a background in writing on overconfidence, I had to kind of reconcile with myself as well as with, the audience of this argument that how could you have these opposing beliefs? And what we found is that they are held about different things. So typically, we are overconfident about ourselves and our ability to deal with things. This is the famous positive illusions, as some psychologists call it.
Right. In other words, when they do surveys, the average person thinks they are more competent than the average person. And they also think they are morally better than the average person. And when you think about it, like, this can't be the case,
Yeah, exactly.
Objectively.
The Lake Wobegon effect.
Right.
And that seems to be quite widespread. I was going to say universal. It's not entirely universal. There's some conditions under which it doesn't occur, and there's more or less in different people, but it's a widespread phenomenon that affects most of us. So that's about assessing ourselves and our ability to deal with things. But when people look out at the world and they look at other actors and they look at the environment, that's where the negativity bias seems to come to the fore. So I can be perfectly confident in myself, my ability, but I can be very worried about the threats out there that I need to be concerned about. So this is interesting and I think highly adaptive, but it's a recipe for disaster, right? Potentially, because it means I see many enemies and I'm overconfident about my ability to defeat them. Mm-hmm. So that's potentially a problem.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that, another kind of famous dynamic is for one country to view maneuvers, military maneuvers or even political ones, that actually are defensive in motivation as offensive.
Right.
I think a contemporary example, in my view, is that Iran has reason to be very insecure geopolitically. They were invaded by Iraq. It was devastating. So, when the U.S., which supported Iraq in that war, invades Iraq, Iran wants to unsettle, destabilize our occupation. They want to displace us in terms of influence. They would like to have Syria as a buffer state and so on. And they have a number of enemies in the area. That's at least a plausible reading of why they want to have a presence in Syria and Iraq. Mm-hmm. But Americans don't read it. They read it as expansiveness. Okay. And this is a common dynamic to read things that at least plausibly have a defensive motivation, as offensive. And I was thinking in reading your paper, one thing that involves is a failure to appreciate that other countries do threat inflation, right? Mm-hmm. That's if we all understood that, both that we do, not only that we do threat inflation and corrected for that, but that other countries do, right, that would probably have a good influence on balance, right?
Yeah, no, if you could really believe it, and you can sit down and study this stuff and understand the the cognitive bias that we all seem to have, but then nevertheless put yourself in a position of power or in a vulnerable position in everyday life, and you just don't want to take the chance, right? So it's about uncertainty as well. You just don't know. And in fact, we have a term for this in international relations. It's the security dilemma. And it's this sort of phenomenon that just seems to make so much sense if you look back across history, that one state building up its armament or its defense, in theory, can be entirely defensive, but you just never know, right? And do you really want to take the chance? And if you want to err on the side of caution, you've always just got to assume the worst. And different theories in international relations might make sort of more or less of this, but some of them make it an absolutely central component of understanding international relations that, unfortunately, sad as it is and bad for the collective, you just have to make sure you're not the sucker, like the prisoner's dilemma. You don't want to be the one who's offering your hand out in case it gets bitten off. And often that can reduce overall cooperation among interacting partners or a collective, but it's sort of the only way to be safe. So it's perfectly adaptive. The question is, to what extent do you have this negativity bias, and at what point does it become costly because you're preventing yourself from taking opportunities for cooperation and avoiding conflict?
Mm-hmm. And I guess one example of how complicated the motivational dynamics get is, one thing we're talking about is individual politicians seeing a threat to their status if they are responsible for the loss of a war, right? It's like a career issue for them. Mm-hmm. It's like you may have to find another line of work. You may not win re-election. Your approval ratings will go down. I mean, that's
right.
Let me ask you, do you take that into account, or are there's a tradition in the foreign policy, the worldview known as realism. I think there's a tradition, at least among some realists, to treat individual nations as if they are just self-interested actors, and to always think about the kind of collective psychology of a nation wanting to keep itself secure. But it's got to be more complicated than that, right? Where do you come down on this question of the extent to which you're going to look into individual politicians' motivations and so on?
Yeah. So, I mean, the rationalist framework, sort of seeing states as black boxes, we, ignore all the complicated political stuff going on inside and just judge how they react to each other like billiard balls. A state given a certain power is going to react given its surrounding and its geography. So, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, these days, I think most of my colleagues are very interested in opening up that black box, understanding what's going on underneath. And a big part of that is understanding leaders, their psychology, and also their interaction with institutions and very importantly, their audiences. So the domestic audience, cost of not doing something. And I think in the Bad World paper, we give the example that many leaders through history have been punished for not preparing for a threat or not understanding a genuine threat. But you don't really find leaders being punished for doing the opposite, right? For over-exaggerating a threat. You could say, well, maybe Iraq was exactly that kind of example. But typically, as the incumbent president say, you want to steer away from being the one who led our country into difficulties because you underplayed a threat. But overplaying the threat, you don't get that same kind of punishment.
Moreover, George W. Bush was reelected. Of course, by the time of his reelection, the full-blown fiasco wasn't its full-blownness wasn't totally evident, but things were heading south. Moreover, the people in the American foreign policy establishment who brought us that disaster, and in commentary and journalism, they're all still in power. I mean, famously, virtually none of them have paid a price.
So you could say even in that extreme example, they weren't punished for that. But I think as a leader, going back to your original question, as a prime minister or a president, it's the last thing you want to do, right? To be exposed as vulnerable and not perceiving a genuine threat.
Right. And you actually cite the example of Chamberlain's famous act of appeasement. We will have, with Hitler, we will have peace in our time, not confronting him, whenever that was, 39? Was it 39, 38?
Yeah, 38 was the Munich conference,
And you note, I mean, kind of interestingly, that might seem like a positive illusion on his part, overconfidence that there would be no trouble, but it did involve, or arguably involved, an emphasis on threats to Britain in the event that they did confront him at that moment. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Yeah,
absolutely. I think, again, back to the paper Bad World on the negativity bias, I think we have a little section in there saying, what about Chamberlain? Surely this is the kind of archetypal counterexample of a state not responding to a huge threat that in retrospect seems obvious. So we talk about that, and one of our main points is that Chamberlain was a little unusual in some ways, right? There were many other people saying, there's a huge threat. Why aren't you doing anything about it? Churchill, of course, being the main one. So yeah, I mean, we shouldn't expect every single instance to kind of conform necessarily to this negativity bias prediction, but on the whole, there seems to be this threat inflation. Sometimes there's exceptions, and in the case of Chamberlain and Nazi Germany, and in the case of Bush and Iraq, there are times when we overestimate a threat that wasn't there, but or do the opposite. So there's exceptions to the rule, of course.
Now, okay, so let's move on. I think people get the idea that if everyone in the is exaggerating threats, bad things could happen. And often Vietnam, another famous case. It's like, in retrospect, what were we worried about? A small country halfway around the world. And we all know what the narrative was, creeping communism, but in retrospect, it seems kind of absurd. And you can do that with, of course, a lot of wars. You guys do a case study on World War I. Maybe we'll get into that, but let's move on to the second, of the three elements that you put under the negativity bias rubric, which is loss aversion.
Right. So this one is already extremely well established. It's very well known because of its connection to prospect theory. The basic idea here is that people are much more averse to losing something than they are to gaining the equivalent thing. So you'd be much more upset if I took £10 away from you than the joy you would experience if I gave you £10. So this is, again, another widely replicated phenomenon. It's a cognitive bias that we all seem to have. Again, there's variation among individuals, but it's very powerful.
And just quickly, one experimental manifestation is if, like, I'm holding a paperclip, and I mean, if somebody says, how much will you pay for this paperclip? I might say, 10 cents. And then once I've got it, if somebody comes along and says, how much will I have to pay you for you to give me that paperclip? I won't say 10 cents. I mean, the experimental finding is, and not with paperclips per se, but I'll say 15 cents, 20 cents, because it just hurts more to lose.
Yeah, it's yours. You don't want to lose it.
Yeah. Right. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, a good analogy is buying houses. This is where it becomes a problem, right? Because people overvalue their own house. They've lived there, they know it, they love it, and they want to sell it for more than people are prepared to buy it for. And this actually, is a problem because it's a market inefficiency.
Yeah.
This is something that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky made famous with their initial experiments on cognitive biases. Loss aversion was one of the big ones in that set. So it's been around for many years, and our point was really that loss aversion is something we already accept as this very powerful negativity bias, but it's one of many biases which you find, which together, come under this umbrella of the negativity bias. So it's yet another kind of manifestation of this bias that we all have.
And what are some examples of how that can get us into trouble in war?
Okay, so loss aversion specifically has been argued to have been a problem in Vietnam, for example. You mentioned Vietnam. So the argument there is that the US could have somehow scaled down or given up early on. Now, giving up, opens a whole can of worms about signaling and so on. But in principle, it would have been possible to draw down rather than escalate. But the decision was to escalate and escalate and escalate. Mm-hmm. And one argument, there are many, and there are rational reasons to escalate as well. But over and above that, it's quite conceivable that having invested so much blood and treasure into the war, there was a very significant unwillingness to lose what you'd already gained, even if that was just, the amount of material plowed into the war.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just so that's one example where it has specifically been used to explain or help understand the US's continued involvement in Vietnam.
And even if there was kind of separately Lyndon Johnson's calculation that he would suffer a loss of political stature if he admitted defeat, the fact that he would suffer that may itself be grounded in loss aversion as experienced at the grassroots level.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. So let's say you're perfectly rational, and as a leader, you've somehow eliminated your own cognitive biases. You are nevertheless, to some extent, pandering to the people. And if they want, to avoid losses, then you've got to do it for them. Mm-hmm. So, this is what some people say. Well, political leaders are different from the students typically that you have in the lab in these psychological experiments. But even if that's the case, then we have to consider the psychological biases among the masses, as it were.
Yeah. And of course, maybe the best current example for America of a Vietnam is Afghanistan. We've been there forever, can't seem to be ready to admit defeat. And of course, people also make arguments that, Afghanistan will descend into chaos, or the Taliban will, this or that will happen. Which is true. On the other hand, things haven't been that rosy for Afghanistan while we've been there. But in any event, does that seems to you to be grounded partly in loss aversion?
So I'd have to look at that case in a bit more detail to say anything definitive, but potentially, yeah. I mean, it's the same kind of scenario where you've been there a long time, you've invested a lot. So one would predict that loss aversion might be one reason why there's still the amount of effort being plowed into it that there is. You might make the argument that it's at a much lower level. So perhaps, the burden of losses is not anything like it was for Johnson in Vietnam.
Yeah. And, also there's the question of psychology. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Cold War psychology. And, there was a pretty widespread view that Russia and China were these kinds of inexorable menaces. The ground had been prepared for people to be reluctant to cede an inch of turf. It was, in other words, Vietnam was thought of as territory you had to hang on to in a way that I don't think Afghanistan is. There is this idea that, if terrorists hold actual territory, they're more of a menace. That's, there people argue about that, but it isn't the same very simple conception of a global chessboard and every square matters.
No, I think that's right. And it was the dominoes falling, right? That losing Vietnam was not just losing Vietnam. It was, opening the floodgates for communism to spread around the world. So if you bought into that domino theory, then that was a significant, thing not to lose. Okay. And I think I agree with you that in the case of Afghanistan, there's also the concern that, if you cede ground, then it can lead to, the spread of bad things, but maybe not to the same extent, same level.
Okay. Now the third thing you group under negativity bias is failure salience. I gather that's your own term, your own concept. Now, is it original to this paper, or have you used it before?
It was original to this paper. Yep, building on other people's work, pointing out similar things, but bringing this together to say, look, here's another important thing about negativity bias. That when people reflect on the past, you see the same dominance of negative phenomena, negative information, negative events weighing much more heavily than equivalent positive events on people's recollections. Now,
this might seem to not be a bad thing, because one part of it you emphasize is that after a negative experience, like losing the war in Vietnam, we are more inclined to reflect on the lessons to be learned and critically evaluate what got us to the point of losing, right? Mm-hmm. So in theory, we should be learning our lessons thanks to failure salience.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we say that, a rational actor or an economist might say, Well, you should learn from your good experiences and your bad experiences. Whatever happens, you should analyze it and work out what went right. What things should you repeat in the good cases, and then what things should you avoid in the bad cases. I think empirically, the point is, well, that may be good advice, but for whatever reason, we do focus on the negative, and that could be more important, right? So doing well is all very well and good, but what you really want to do is avoid making mistakes again. That's the kind of costly thing, which, could be fatal, whereas just doing well is, good, but not a matter of life or death. So I think there's an adaptive logic to this. Again, it's just, and if you look at some of the animal behavior literature, there's very powerful effects. For example, rats learning not to touch food that has been poisoned in the past and things like that. So there's certain things that get burned into memory just to avoid worst case scenarios.
Okay, so one example that comes to mind is what was called Vietnam Syndrome in the United States. And that was a term used by people who wanted more military intervention than they saw from the U.S. in the immediate post-Vietnam aftermath. And that's the kind of, assuming they were right, let's just stipulate that maybe they were right, and I forget where they wanted us to intervene that we didn't, but let's just assume for the sake of argument they were right. That would be an example of failure salience being a bad thing.
Yeah. So you want freedom of action, right? You want to be able to do what you want uncolored by good or bad things in the past. If it's right to do something, then you should do it. And the argument here is that whether it was right or wrong, they didn't allow themselves the freedom of action because they felt like the experience of Vietnam meant they were going to end up in another quagmire. Mm-hmm. And that was often the charge when they did get involved. People started immediately saying, is this going to be another Vietnam?
Of course, given the other biases we've discussed, it's unclear whether freedom of action is a good thing, right? When we are free to act, we are under the sway of these kinds of unfortunate delusions.
Yep, no, that's right. My point is simply that the argument here would be that the cognitive biases associated with failure salience would artificially narrow your range of options because you would wrongly think that you must avoid certain kinds of situations just because of making or overweighting certain analogies to the past. Mm-hmm. Now, there could be very important lessons, right? And earlier we mentioned that this could be adaptive because the thing you want to do most is avoid mistakes, and maybe having experienced something which didn't work, it's good to be steered away from doing it again. But the problem is, at least in the case of international relations and state behavior, you want to be trying to make rational calculations based on cost benefit analysis and all the information you can have. And if it's being colored by psychological biases, then presumably you're being pushed away from what a rational actor might otherwise decide to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, so Vietnam is a case where at least arguably we, in a sense, overlearned our lesson, at least according to people who say Vietnam syndrome was a problem. And certainly it's possible. You can imagine becoming overly averse to intervention. It seems to me the Iraq War is a kind of an interesting case, and it's almost an example of maybe undergeneralizing or something. In other words, so everyone agreed Iraq, pretty much everyone, by, say, 2007 agreed Iraq had been a disaster. Libya came along, and we again found ourselves trying to overthrow a regime. Now, we were doing it in a different way. We didn't introduce ground troops. It was done from the air. And if people don't remember what happened, well, the UN authorization was mainly about protecting a civilian population. And then arguably we exceeded that mandate and went for out and out regime change. We did go for out and out regime change. Arguably we exceeded the mandate. In any event, so it was different, but it was still, I think a lot of people would say, disastrous. Libya remains in chaos. And so it became kind of clear that had been a disaster. Then Syria came along, and, okay, we didn't introduce ground troops. We didn't do much bombing, at least of the regime. We did bombing of ISIS. But we did engage in a regime change operation by arming proxy forces. And I think now more and more people, and not enough in my view, but more and more, recognize that didn't work well. It fanned the flames of a civil war, just magnified the magnitude of the carnage, the exodus of the refugees, and of course, it wouldn't have been. It would have been nothing to celebrate for Assad to just brutally suppress the original insurrection, which would have happened if we and our allies hadn't introduced the weapons. But compared to what happened, maybe that intervention was bad. So you could say there's a general lesson there that regime change through force just doesn't seem to be a good idea. And maybe people are slowly closing in on that. But do you take my point about how we seem to have not very readily learned, if that is the lesson at the general level, it has taken us a long time to get the picture?
Yeah, I think that there's two things going on. One is regime change a good idea or not? And the other is the extent to which you're committed to making it happen. Right, because the lesson of Vietnam was to be very wary of getting involved in other states' internal conflicts, essentially, especially when they have external backing. And when it came to the first Persian Gulf War, remember the Powell doctrine of overwhelming force. So they were not going to even try anything unless they had absolutely overwhelming force. There's no question they were going to be able to win militarily on the ground, unlike in Vietnam. But they believed that so much that, they stopped at the border of Iraq and they had very limited aims. And then people later said, well, they were too frightened of regime change because they just wanted to carry out their very specific little objective with overwhelming force, win comprehensively and stop. And then Libya is almost the opposite, where you just want this hands off, do it all from the air, let the other NATO allies take a lot of the burden as well and not get too involved and try and let the local forces, win the victory on the ground, which sometimes works. So I think, part of the problem is if you're not sure about doing something and you don't want to commit ground troops, then maybe in those circumstances, regime change may or may not be successful because you haven't committed to doing it effectively or swiftly, right? You're almost throwing the dice and sort of interfering from the outside without really being able to dictate what happens on the ground. So I think it's commitment. And then the other big question is, well, is it a good idea or not? And of course, it depends on who you speak to. If you look at the case of Nazi Germany or Japan, then clearly it can be highly effective. But that's back to the massive commitment it took to make it happen.
I'm curious, how does the American behavior I've described look from Britain? Of course, there are different people in Britain with different views, and it's always hard to talk about a collective view. But I guess Britain has, to some extent or another, joined in all three of the enterprises I just described. Is that certainly the Iraq War? And I think certainly the arming of the Syrian rebels and of course the Libyan thing. As I said, originally there was a UN mandate, so it had passed the Security Council. Nominally, even Russia supported it, and certainly Britain had to because they're on the Security Council. But is there more kind of head scratching in Britain than there might be in America about America's adventurism, nonetheless, or is there not? Yeah,
no, I think there definitely is, and there's sort of as you say, two main camps to this. Britain is a small power now that we used to be ourselves criticized for being involved everywhere all the time and interfering. And I think there's certainly a very powerful camp in the UK, and there always has been, that America is constantly overstepping itself and getting involved where it shouldn't. Not just because it's not doing it effectively, but because they should not be doing it, morally or politically or whatever. But then there is another camp which says, well, the world is complicated and there are perfectly justifiable cases where intervention is needed, especially from humanitarian cases. And there are many examples we could think of where if it hadn't been for the United States, nothing would have happened. But then you've got this problem of, well, then we're just relying on the US, to lead the way when the rest of us can't really do very much. So it's complicated, and there's definitely, supporters and opposers. People like, Jeremy Corbyn are essentially pacifists, very anti, US interventionism. Mm-hmm. But in the foreign policy community, I think there's much more support for the US because they tend to see that there are many things in the world that require significant material resources and military resources, and they just can't be done without the US.
Right, but which ones have worked out well? Which ones are thought to have worked out well?
Well, you could argue that sort of the initial stages in Afghanistan was successful.
Yeah, unfortunately, they entailed the later stages.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the problem, that, you get involved and then it gets complicated. But there's been some other examples where, humanitarian intervention in Somalia, for example, again, had some bad consequences later, but initially helped humanitarian aid get through with Bush Sr.
Yeah, well, that's a case where there's a lot of people would say there wasn't enough, right? Yeah. So why don't we? I do want to get around to the subject of kind of the actual thesis of the paper, that these various elements should be lumped under the single rubric of negativity bias. But first, why don't you run us through the World War I example, just kind of quickly, because you do use it as kind of paradigmatic.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, you raised Iraq. We start with Iraq because that's sort of a recent example where the negativity bias seems to have been quite salient. But we wanted to have a more in-depth case study of a famous case where lots of international relations theories are sort of tested with World War I, because, if you can't help understand World War I, then how important a theory is it? And we also picked World War I because one common argument about World War I is that it was largely a problem of overconfidence, right? That people were way too optimistic about not only that they would win, but they would win very quickly. So we said, well, hang on a second, let's look at this from the negativity bias point of view. And amidst all that positive overconfidence that you can find, sometimes exaggerated, but it was there, you also find the negativity bias alive and well. And it's back to what we said earlier about these two opposing biases. So the individual states leaders, particularly military leaders, were often very confident about their own military forces and what they could achieve. But at the same time, this was in the context of severe, fear about other states and the threats to them. We focused on Germany. Germany felt itself encircled by France and Russia, felt itself to be very vulnerable, even though it had the most powerful army in Europe. The second most powerful navy was growing. A.J.P. Taylor, the famous historian, argued that peace rather than war would have brought Germany mastery of Europe in a few years. So there's the argument that they were just way over concerned about their situation. It's very hard to know in hindsight. But there was this idea of the so-called Weltpolitisch Angst, that they were very concerned about their declining political influence in the world. France and Britain were expanding their empires, and Germany was being left behind and encircled. So that was the kind of fear that seemed to be quite important in understanding the origins of World War I. And it, as we argue in much more detail in the paper, fits a lot of the predictions of the negativity bias. Okay.
So on the question of of how unified these phenomena are, you're putting them under negativity bias. Have you gotten some blowback from kind of evolutionary psychologists? I mean, I know your own perspective is somewhat Darwinian. You have you have two PhDs, right? One in is that right?
For my sins, yeah. One in biology and one in political science. It was kind of an accident, but that's what I ended up with. Yeah.
So, but I would imagine, a lot of evolutionary psychologists emphasize what's called domain specificity. In other words, individual mental adaptations happen. An adaptation being a kind of a technical term for, you might say, a functional, a discrete, somewhat discrete functional part of the brain or the body generally that is, quote, designed by natural selection to accomplish some task. And in some cases, I think the argument would be, well, to know whether a positive or negative bias makes sense, you have to ask yourself, what domain are we in? So, for example, males, and I don't know if this works in the other direction with female heterosexuals looking at males, but I know male heterosexuals looking at females from a distance are, it's been documented that they exaggerate their attractiveness relative to what their verdict will be once they see them up close. In other words, they tend, if you show a young man, a young woman from a distance, and then he goes, and kind of, imagines how attractive they would look up close, and then you show him to him up close, they are more often disappointed than pleasantly surprised because they have exaggerated. That's a documented thing. And I think, a certain kind of overconfidence is, on balance. I mean, different men are different. Self-esteem matters, but I think, under certain circumstances, men are inclined to overread cues of interest from the woman. Of course, this can lead to real trouble. And has. And then there's, just relatedly, I remember a specific, in my distant past, in my premarital dating history, I remember a case where I was on a date in New York. It was a night, and this, she said, hey, we were like, where should we go? She said, well, Battery Park. I went there. That was kind of cool. We went there, and she had been there during the day, and now it was at night, and there was nobody there. And she was like, whoa, this is kind of creepy. And my reaction was, of course, bravado, right? And it wasn't entirely false in the sense that I felt that I would be kind of capable of fending off a threat if one should materialize, which was, of course, nonsense. I'm not that physically imposing. Even if some guy hadn't had a weapon, I probably would have been bad at dealing with it. But it was in my interest, because there was this woman I was trying to impress, to actually feel impressive. Now, and I just want to say, if I had been alone, I have no doubt that I would have been more worried, felt more insecure, and gotten the hell out of there fast. Okay? So these are cases where there was positive bias. To understand them, you have to understand the domain, why they made sense. If I had been alone, negative bias would have, exaggerating the sense of threat would have made Darwinian sense. So this is the generic argument. Aside from that, of course, you can, there are individual issues that arise, that you, to some extent, deal with in your paper where, wait a second, isn't this a positive thing? And so on. But what is your reaction to the argument for domain specificity?
Yeah. Well, so I absolutely think it's highly context dependent, and adaptations aren't usually blanket adaptations. If you imagine anger as an adaptation, right? If we're angry all the time, that'd be terrible. It just wouldn't be effective. But if we get angry under certain circumstances, then it's highly adaptive. So I think most behavioral and many physiological traits are exactly like that. They come to the fore in specific situations where they can help us. And it's adaptive for them to be able to, switch on and off or increase or decrease their level. So I totally think that's important. There is this sort of more specific argument of domain specificity, that there's different sort of modules in the brain for dealing with specific tasks, like a Swiss Army knife. I'm not personally wedded to that particular view. There's been some challenges to it, and we may find as neuroscience develops that, it's not quite as simple as that. But however the brain works, I think it's definitely the case that adaptations are context dependent. And this negativity bias paper was particularly interesting because it forced us to understand why that might be the case. Otherwise, how can we reconcile having a cognitive bias towards overconfidence and a cognitive bias towards negativity? So I think it makes perfect sense. We're very concerned about the world. We're very concerned about other actors. We should be. Evolution set us up that way because they're the things which can injure us or kill us. But then when we have to deal with these things, like when you were in Battery Park, you want to be filled with confidence because that can increase your performance if you have to deal with another actor or a challenging environment. And when I wrote my book on overconfidence, I was particularly interested in that kind of thing. And actually, it could be that, I'm speculating, but your levels of testosterone were probably increased, right, at that time. And there's some nice work showing that when men are around women, they become especially competitive and experience high levels of circulating testosterone. So there's some knowledge about, the biological mechanisms here that might be induced by the context and then actually change our behavior. And not for the sake of it, they can actually change our performance as a result as well.
Okay. And then to get back to the context of your argument, what do you say when people say, in the Iraq War, our overconfidence was maybe as big a part of the problem as our threat exaggeration? Isn't that a fundamentally positive thing? Do you just agree and say, well, yeah, there's some positive things, or do you point to some negative elements in that seemingly positive thing, or both?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of both. And so up to now, I've kind of made my trade pointing out cognitive biases and how they can lead us astray, how they can help understand why we make mistakes and we deviate from rationality and kind of get ourselves into trouble. But, all along the way, we've been pointing out that these are actually adaptations. We have them because they helped us make good decisions in the past, not bad ones. And maybe the modern world is just so different from the environment in which we evolved that we're just constantly making mistakes all the time. But actually, I don't really believe that. In everyday life, we are using these cognitive biases all the time, and they help us get along and, get out of bed every morning and feel confident enough to go and do things and meet life's challenges. And even Daniel Kahneman, who, stresses the mistakes that we make in the lab, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he points out that, yeah, we make these mistakes, but actually these same system one intuitions, as he calls them, actually happening all the time. And they help us make good decisions often as well. And that's, most of what we're doing. So the mistakes are kind of obvious when they cause costs and disasters, but at other times they're working perfectly well and nobody notices them because they're leading to success rather than disaster. So I think that same argument can be made in international relations. And this is exactly what my new book is about. And it's about when our cognitive biases help us make good decisions, even in the arena.
Now, which book is that?
So this is a new book called Strategic Instincts, and it's coming out next year.
Oh, great! So is it an academic book or
it's an academic book with some case studies, and it's coming out with Princeton in 2020.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So now you wouldn't deny that changes in environment relative to the environment we evolved in can make things tendencies of ours more destructive and counterproductive, right? I mean, the most obvious case being an environment of nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah.
And then at an individual level, like road rage, superhighways and stuff, right?
Yeah. So the potential for mismatch between our evolved mechanisms and, whether they're useful or not is huge.
Yeah.
Scale, technology, all of these things make, the Stone Age brain, as it were, a massive liability. But I think we shouldn't always assume that it always leads to mistakes and disasters. It's context dependent. It depends.
Okay.
Do you agree with that, Robert?
Well, I certainly agree that there's a big mismatch problem. I think there was a problem in the ancestral environment, if only in the sense that, remember what natural selection optimizes for is the chances that your genes will get replicated. And that doesn't always coincide by any means with actual human psychological utility, right? And that alone, I'll just leave that as an abstract point that by itself means that we would have been, if our goal is to be happy, we would have been ill-advised to follow our instincts, even in the environment of our evolution. Right. And following them now can get us into whole new kinds of trouble. I guess the final thing to contemplate is, leaving aside arguments over whether all of this should be lumped under negativity bias and so on. I think no one who's paying attention to the literature doubts that there are distortions of thought and perception, cognitive biases, that get us into wars that are on balance bad for humankind, often bad for both sides. And it's just kind of absurd. And the good news is we're learning more and more about it. In principle, our species could become more aware of these things and so fall prey to them less often. Do you see any signs of that happening? And in any event, how do you recommend that we go about making it happen faster?
Yeah, so this is the $6 million question. We're definitely learning more about it. It's amazing, the literature on the cognitive biases. And there are ways to implement that. So, for example, we have this nudge unit in the government where they take the findings of behavioral science and use that to actually improve public policy in all sorts of ways, from changing survey forms to changing tax forms that people have to fill out. So they're trying to correct for these biases in the way they gather information and conduct policy. So there are definitely ways to intervene. At the level of leadership, I think there are things that could be done. Often in the cognitive bias literature, people say, you must have a devil's advocate who's constantly questioning assumptions and checking that there's not a bias. In our paper, we suggest that we also need an angel's advocate, who is someone who tries to make sure people are not consumed by their negativity biases and the good things as well as bad things in their interactions with other states. It's easy to say and maybe hard to do. But I think that's quite important. So if you just take the predictions from the negativity bias and say, what does this suggest about how we view China, for example, right? The prediction is we see China as more of a threat than it is. Now, there'll be a lot of people listening or watching who'll say, well, it is a potential threat, or there's a lot of uncertainty. We have to be very careful. And I'm saying, fine, I agree. But the prediction from the negativity bias is that we're going to overestimate whatever that threat is to some extent. And this will reduce options for cooperation. So without being a kind of airy-fairy, bunny hugger, I think there is potential to kind of lower our suspicions a little bit. And, sometimes to an extent, an olive branch where we're otherwise predisposed by our negativity bias to be overly skeptical and overly suspicious of other states, as we have been for centuries.
And what about kind of grassroots psychological change, which I suppose could get us into, at the risk of sounding too touchy-feeling, into the realm of kind of spiritual change? I mean, we've said that in a democracy, a lot of the impetus for the for kind of confused policy arises from the grassroots level. Even if they're an intermediary is a calculating politician, they're still dealing with the fact that people are very prone to threat sensitivity and so on. I've been my last book was about mindfulness meditation, and I'm something of an advocate of it because I do think it can make people somewhat more equanimous. It's not a simple cure by any means, but if you're really devoted to it and doing a lot of it, I do think it makes you less susceptible to the kinds of swaying of the passions that otherwise you might be subject to. Do you think about this at all? And of course, leave aside, I'm not just flacking for Buddhism. I mean, all religious traditions get into these issues. And therapeutic traditions do too. Have you thought? I mean, my view of the world increasingly is that maybe saving the planet is going to require something sweeping, a change of worldview that happens at the grassroots. Do you have a view on this?
Yeah, well, so it's another $6 million question, right? Because we are currently facing, this massive global challenge of climate change, and again, to whatever extent you think it's real and think it's a problem, we have to do something about it. And it's very hard to do something about it precisely because of all the problems we've been talking about today, international relations, states being suspicious of each other, having to stay ahead of each other and be competitive and so on, look after their citizens. So I do think, we failed basically because the science tells us what we need to do and we can't do it. We can't get there because of the politics of international relations. Maybe we're slowly getting there, but that could well be too late for a lot of places and countries and people. So I do think we need some kind of radical change. And the one thing I kind of feel like might just happen on its own is when you're facing a common collective threat enough, then people pull together. Right, we know this at all scales, from small groups to societies and multiple nations sometimes. And I think as things get bad enough, this will focus people's minds and realize they're kind of all part of this collective challenge. And the problem is that when you get to that point that everyone buries the hatchet kind of thing, it might be that comes too late. Right? That only happens. It only overcomes these other barriers once it's so bad that it's kind of a bit too late to do anything about it. But I do feel like it's sort of reaching this kind of global identity kind of idea, which is very hard to achieve, that might actually be necessary.
And what do you see as the threat that might be most galvanizing, or the threats? I mean, obviously there's climate change. In America, at least, not everybody's persuaded that that's a big problem. But there are or do you just mean like awareness of nuclear weapons? What kinds of things do you mean?
Yeah, I don't think nuclear weapons would do it, actually. I think it would be climate change, maybe something to do with, global health pandemics or perhaps poverty. These kind of global issues which are just affecting, millions or billions of people at once. But again, I think, we've got these very high barriers to cross over before we start sacrificing self-interest at the state level and really start making massive commitments. Collectively, it's the prison's dilemma, writ large, and it's very hard to solve, as you've, written beautifully about as well.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you started off talking about spiritualism and religion, and I mentioned that my last book was about religion, and that book was all about how religion has this special power in promoting cooperation. It is a bad rap today because of all of the world events and the role that religion sometimes plays. But in the origins of religion and in many manifestations of religion today, the thing that's striking to me about it is how effective it is at promoting cooperation and getting people to put aside their self-interest and act towards the collective good, as long as people share that religion, usually. So there's some kind of special power there in the kind of the supernatural and, believing about things or having kind of some sense that there's something bigger than us. And I do wonder if that maybe can be marshaled somehow at the global level to do something, say, about climate change. Just imagine if part of your religion was, number one priority is conserve the earth. It could be that all the science in the world would never motivate you as much as that one belief would. So there's got to be something there about maybe trying to think about how to motivate people beyond just logic, rationality. Here's the science. Here's what we should do.
Yeah. Well, some people would say that environmentalism has become the kind of secular religion taught in some American public schools. Not all the people who say that approve of it. But it's also true that within some religious traditions, some people at least are going back to scripture and emphasizing, kind of stewardship of the earth as say a biblical value, but also a value in other traditions. Yeah. And then there's the invaders from Mars scenario, but I guess we can't. That would be the threat that most tapped into human psychology, right? The actual beings threatening you, and I think that's what happens. Something like that in the movie "The Day the Earth Stood Still," and at least one episode of The Outer Limits. But that
was the asteroid, wasn't it? That was just an asteroid. It doesn't have to be aliens.
In which one? In
The Day the Earth Stood Still? Was that an
I think, well, actually, I'm confused. There was definitely a spaceship that landed, but I think maybe the spaceship contained like enlightened beings. I'm getting confused. Did they want to pretend there was a threat were they smart enough to know that? There was some globally galvanizing thing involving actual visitors. And then in the episode of The Outer Limits, some human beings got together and decided to stage a fake invasion from Mars to galvanize, to unify the planet. Okay. So maybe I'll just do that. Maybe you and I could do that.
Yeah, the science fiction writers have already, they're way ahead of us. There's something in it. And I guess just tying it back to the Bad World article, one interesting prediction that I haven't made much of is that, I said, we shouldn't be so worried about China. The other prediction might be, we shouldn't be so worried about climate change, which makes me think there's something wrong there. But it maybe suggests to me that this helps explain, why it's so hard to kind of create action, because we have all of these cognitive biases affecting our beliefs and our perceptions. And as you said, we're learning about them more and more all the time. But they don't always work in our favor, right? We find out about something and we think, okay, well, we should just bias our beliefs back in the other direction. Sometimes we find something like this and it tells us that actually we should be less worried about climate change. So there's the question of, is that true? If it's true, should we counter it? How do we counter it? It's kind of an interesting conundrum.
Well, and there's the problem that it affects different countries in different ways. Somebody recently told me, I noticed the sun is shining outside your window, and somebody told me that in Britain, climate change seems to be making it a slightly less grim place to live because there's actually less cloud cover. Is that true?
I'm not sure about cloud cover. We could do with a couple more degrees here, but, you can't really say that kind of thing these days. But we have more extreme weather events. This is the thing. People think,
you do. Even
degrees, fine, but that's not the issue. Right? The issue is we'll get more droughts, more floods,
right?
Extreme summers. It's not a nice gradual thermostat we can adjust up and down.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks so much, Dominic. Now, so the books you've written so far, Overconfidence and War, probably most relevant to this. God is Watching You is another one. Failing to Win, with the subtitle Perceptions of Victory and Defeat in International Politics. This paper is called Bad World, the Negativity Bias in International Politics. Now, if people Google that and PDF, can they find a place to pirate a free copy, or do they have to actually fork over money?
Good question. So you can definitely find the abstracts on the MIT journal website. If you Google Bad World, Dominic Johnson, I think it will pop up. Do they have a free PDF on their website? I'm not sure. You could.
There is this magic site. I will not disclose the URL. I don't have the URL at hand. There is this magic site where you plug in any journal article URL, and you get an actual copy. Did you know about this?
No.
It's an amazing resource.
Okay.
And it's illegal, it must be. But anyway, not that I would ever make use of it.
The other trick I've found is if you put in the exact title with the quotes, you'll find it wherever it is on the web, and there may be a PDF somewhere.
Yeah, and sometimes add PDF.
I'd be happy to send it, of course, as well.
Okay. So, and where else can people find you online? Are you on Twitter?
I have a Twitter account. Yeah, I think I'm a follower of you. And
what's your handle?
It's good question. Dom Johnson, I think. Got to check.
DomJohnson.
That's right. Word. Yeah, I'd have to quickly check, but I'm on Twitter. If you to Dominic Johnson Twitter, I think it should come up.
Dominic with no K at the end. It ends in C.
That's correct. And I have a web page at Oxford, which is Dominic Johnson Oxford. That web page will come up, and it's got my papers and links on there. So. Thanks. Okay. And I'm at Robert Writer on Twitter. That's WRIGHTER. Well, thank you so much. And I hope your work helps save the world. Well, thank you, Robert. It was fascinating to talk to you and great to see you. Okay. We'll see you down the road. Take care.